Welcome, Brett. Brett Iggulden here is probably one of the best known traditional jazz players in Australia, who's had a long history of as a co-founder of the Red Onions Jazz Band, and we're here today to hear his journey through music. So welcome, Brett.
Thanks, mate.
Now, can we kick off and go right back to the start? Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you got interested in jazz.
My father was the cause of my interest in jazz. He had a trumpet, didn't play it much. There's a picture that I have of him playing the trumpet. But he was an avid collector, along with my uncle. And we would go into Melbourne when I was a kid, Saturday morning, and buy in those days, the latest 78. I was born in 1945, and we started to do that probably when I was 5 or 6.
Right.
So I was listening to good jazz. He had really, when I look back on it, he had really good taste as far as I can tell.
Yep.
He loved Fats Waller. He liked Louis, of course, but he likes a lot of things that it took me a while to like. The main real formative interest that made me want to play, beyond listening, was he brought home the George Lewis Climax session.
Yes.
And it was an LP by then, and I wore that one out, and I think I've worn out about 4 others between when he brought it into the house in the late 50s and now. And it stayed with me, that seemed to me that New Orleans revival that George and Kid Howard were on was the main triggering to me to get to play. And then we lived in Moorabbin in those days, and the Yarra Yarra band had a gig. They'd only been going a little while, and it was near Moorabbin Station, near the bowling rink there. And we used to go on a Saturday night walk there. It was like a Friday night jazz or a Saturday, I can't remember which night it was. And there they were playing the stuff that George was playing, and we were kids dancing and jumping around and making use of ourselves. And that was me and 2 other original members of the band were doing that.
Who was that?
A guy called Kim Lynch, a tuba player, and a guy called John Pike, the piano player. Both of them left at different times. John to become a doctor, and Kim left to join the Loved Ones, the band in 1963. Yeah.
So, when did you actually pick up an instrument?
I started to learn the violin when I was about 8 or 9. I had a fantastic teacher, and she was a very important part of my approach. The approach to music that she had provided for me was far more than just how you hold the fiddle and play it. I wasn't a great fiddle player, but I wasn't a bad reader, and where she lived was round the corner from Dad's factory. I used to go after school, the factory, and then round and have a lesson with her. And that usually sometimes went for 2 hours. And she was a fiddle player with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra.
Oh.
And she just knew stuff about music. And it was a bond of a young guy with an older woman who was just so interesting. And she died, and I never found another fiddle player teacher that I could get on with, because she was so special. And I thought, I'll start to play the drums. So I played the drums, and I was playing drums by then at the school and I was still in the bloody junior school. Because I could read music, they made me the lead left drummer in a pipe band. I could barely carry the drum. It was, it's another story. So I played the drums for a little while pretty badly, and then got a guitar, and I had a go at that for a little while, and I was even worse at that. And then I just thought, no, I'm going to get a brass instrument. I bought a trumpet. And Dad took me into Bob Clemens, and we bought a K-modified Selma Cornet in about 1959, 1960, and I still have it.
So that you've been playing the trumpet for 65 years, or nearly 65 years.
And it's a love-hate relationship. as Bob Bernard always used to say, I did a lot of gigs with Bob on saxophone and some on trumpet, and we'd always come off the stand and Bob would invariably say, it's a mug's game, it's a mug's game. He'd walk off the stand, it's a mug's game. Trumpet playing, the mug's game. And he's right.
You've got to constantly keep up to be able to play it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not something that you can
you sign on for life. You know, saxophone, you vibrate the reed with your gob and you blow a bit of air over and it's not that hard.
Yeah.
And you can, if you work at it, you can get a nice sound. I don't think I ever have, but I will one day. But the trumpet, you've just got to keep exercising and doing long tones and exercises and keep up with the music and yeah. But it's like a religion.
Yes.
After all these years,
yes.
If I don't do it, I miss it.
Yes. So do you practice on a daily basis?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's really good. So
not always exercises. Sometimes I love melodies and I like digging out songs and nutting out how they fit together harmonically and all that stuff. So I usually do the same exercises each day, and sometimes it's only a few minutes, but they are what are called long tones from a guy called, I forget his name, but
yep.
But that sets you up, and then you just play songs,
right?
Listen to stuff and play it, and then work it out on the piano and work it back.
So, did you have any trumpet lessons? Who gave you trumpet lessons?
Yeah, Bob Bernard. I bumped into him once coming out of the same bloke I'd discovered, a guy called Norm Darth. Norm Darth was somewhere near some inner suburb of Melbourne, and he wrote a book about what they now generically called lip flexibilities, and it was basically slurring, endlessly slurring and breath attack. I won't go into detail, and his whole idea was that it was a good idea you didn't kill your lips with too much pressure. If you look at Louis Armstrong's face, he's an old style player, God love him, but you can see that his lips are all deformed.
Yes.
And he did have a lot of lip trouble. There were periods where he just, but he obviously worked his way through it. Norm's theory was that you could blow with a lot less pressure, and the best way to do it was a series of exercises he developed and published them, and they're still available.
Yeah.
And there was another guy called Merv Smith. There was another guy called George Dobson.
Yep.
You know, I spent a bit of time with all of them, and they all became friends. And
George Dobson was the trumpet.
Yeah.
Trio.
Yeah, he's a lovely guy.
Yeah.
I sold a guy out of his old trumpet trio, trumpet not that long ago.
Yeah.
One of the trumpets I didn't want to use anymore.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, I had lessons, but not, I was playing. The minute I started to play, Alan Brown and I and a few others formed the Red Onions.
Yep.
It was called the Gin Bottle Jazz Band in the beginning, and because there was a record Dad had of a guy called Carl Hale, an American guy, called the Gin Bottle Jazz Band, and we loved it.
Yep.
When we thought that was the thing to model on. And then we went on the ABC and they said, no, you can't have that name, you're all under 15 or 16.
Yeah.
So we changed it to the Red Onion, and that was Sidney Bechet, Louis Armstrong, Jazz Babies.
In order to that,
away we went. You know?
Yeah, so that was the start of the Red Onion. So tell us how you got going with that, and did your overseas tour and all the rest of it?
The Onion started because of an interest in jazz by some kids that went to Haileybury, some kids that didn't. Haileybury College, Alan Brown and I were there. Alan Brown and Bill Howard and I all lived in Beaumaris within about a kilometre of each other. Mm-hmm. We all flew model planes together. My father was the president of the Gliding Federation of Australia. I was always interested in aviation. I've flown gliders nearly all my life, still do when I get the opportunity. But the aero modelling was a kind of a common link. And then we started to listen to, I'd moved to Beaumaris by then, and we started to listen to a lot more records, and we started to meet up and think, yeah, we could do this. And Bill bought a trombone and was a natural.
Yeah. By
then Al was playing drums pretty well. I was playing okay. And the first gig we had was down at Ricketts Point in the little sailing club there. We
Yep.
put her on ourselves,
Yep.
and away we went. And from that, and you remember, if that time, about 1960, 61, there were jazz dancers. No
Yeah.
grog, young people from school going out and
Yep.
dancing and listening
Yep.
to jazz.
Yep.
You know? And so it wasn't long before we were working for the guy who owned number 6 Darling Street, what was his name? It'll come to me. Anyhow, he had a whole lot of jazz clubs,
Yep.
those dancers.
Yep.
And next thing you know, we're paying 3 or 4 gigs a week.
Yep.
Practice,
So
practice,
how did you get your repertoire? Did you just gradually build it up?
Aid was on the scene pretty early. It sounds weird now because it's much more accessible than it was in those days, but we didn't even know how to get the chords for various songs we wanted to play. Aid said, "Oh yeah, get chord books. Yeah, I have one." You know, and they all were.
Yeah.
All the changes.
Yeah.
No, some of them lead lines.
Yeah.
But none of us were great readers. By then, you know, I'd pretty much forgotten how to read. So it was all done, put together. As the band put it together, everything it did, with some exceptions, there were little parts written, but by and large, it was all put together with heart and ear.
Yeah.
And I don't regret that. I think
Yeah.
that was a good
Well, that's probably why you're such a good, ability to be able to improvise now.
Yeah,
isn't it?
it is part of it.
You're just doing there. Yes, it's interesting. I was reading a book by Tony Gould just recently, which was very, very good, and he talked about that one of the conductor was saying that there were people in the symphony orchestra who can't play Happy Birthday without a chart.
That's right.
And so there you go, it's on there.
No,
So-
but this is a huge debate that we shouldn't have at this moment, but it's a huge debate that you've got conservatoriums pumping kids out that can play things on the saxophone I will never play. A, because I don't really want to, and B, because I've always seen music even as a young person, as a means of expressing things about me.
Yes,
That sounds pretty self-centred, but that's what it is, and bugger it.
yes, yes.
And so if that involves becoming what I see in a lot of trumpet players, great at calisthenics but shit at music,
Yeah,
or in saxophones, great at filling in every conceivable gap with a note that might be appropriate or not and running to the next one as fast as you can,
yep.
and not trying to play something where at the end of it they all get up and say, I just had an experience. And it wasn't only my experience, it was the experience that I had that I was able to convey to someone. Now that sounds very
Yeah.
But that's, at this age, that's where it is. So,
Well, we might come back to that,
Yeah.
about the future in a little while. Now, tell us then about when you took off on the great trip overseas.
we got to play a lot of gigs in Melbourne, and we played at the hotel in Brighton, which is now Mario's, but was in those days the Royal Terminus. Jono wrote a rag about it, Frank Johnson. And we played there Friday and Saturday night to a lot of people, sitting in a bar, and that was when 10 o'clock closing came in. And we had more work in Melbourne really than we deserved, but we did to get all that work. One night, Tony Charlton, the impresario guy from TV and stuff, came in and said, "You blokes ought to take this overseas." Richard Miller was planning to go off to live in London for a while, and all of a sudden Tony said, "Oh, we could get you a gig on the Sitmar line. Why don't you take the boat over and just go to Europe and see how you go?" So off we went. That was how it was.
Right. So you got a free trip over.
We were we picture this. We got on a ship going to London with 2,300 souls on it on board, which I suspect 1,800 were young women whose parents stupidly thought going to England on a boat was a safe way for their daughter to get there intact. What they didn't realise was that there were only, the balance of the crew was either crew, who were mostly males, or people like us who were part crew and part passenger, and the rest of them passengers. So it was a bit of a love fest, and there was a fair bit of, the boat went through Panama, and one of the anecdotes about that was that Rowan Smith, the piano player, who died not that long ago, got off the boat and went away and came back with a bag of Panamanian red, a sugar bag full. And I wasn't a dope smoker. There was a few people that liked to toke, and they set up the dope smokers' ring near the air intake, the main air intake of the lower cabins. And there was about 20 of them who'd go and smoke this, and they worked their way through it. We were halfway to Lisbon, and they'd gone through the whole thing. And I always wondered why people were wandering around the boat with big smiles on their faces. Because they were smoking, and anyhow, it was a great trip.
A trip over. So where did you go to first? Did you go straight to Poland?
No, we went to London and we got engaged with Graham Bell. Had a guy who in those days was young. His name was Lynn Dutton. He was the manager of the Bell Band for a lot of the time. We ended up calling him Done Nothing because he didn't do much for us. But ultimately we started to find our way, and we found a guy who was a booker called Don Aldridge, Decent Don, and he started to get us work. And you must remember, in those days, in 1966 I think it was when we got there were jazz clubs, local jazz clubs all over, up and down England, all over the place. There was more work than bands, and there was a lot of bands, and there were a lot of good bands. So we found ourselves playing in good venues pretty quickly once we got an agent.
Yeah.
I'd negotiated the Polish thing before we left Australia, and that happened after we'd been playing in England for about 4 months.
Right. So tell us about what happened when you.
We get this crazy Polish airliner from London to East Germany, and get kicked off the plane at East Germany and get drunk with all the other musos on the plane. There were a lot of other Pommy musos, including Georgie Foam and his band. And the only thing they had was Cuban Bacardi. I've never been able to drink Bacardi rum since that trip. And then they flew us in this plane where there were guards with guns over their shoulders sitting on camp chairs in the aisles, not even strapped down. Now, I'm a pilot, mate. I even was then. And I looked out the window and I saw this big bloody thunderhead Q-Nim cloud right over Warsaw that we're heading for. And as we hit that, the plane just went, woohoo, woohoo. And these people were pushed up and down, and it was. Anyhow, we got off the plane. Some of the members of the plane, including one of the guards I was happy to see, were green and had vomited. And that's how we entered Warsaw. It was fantastic. And we were there for about 3 weeks.
Right, okay. So...
Fantastic.
Yeah. I remember reading a little bit of what Alan Brown's comments were about when you got there and you heard people like Roland Kirk. Well,
these things are all conditioned by time, right? We started off, Alan Brown also wrote a song called I'm a Ford Dealer's Son from Denny. And he also I wrote the music and he wrote the words to a song called Crisis, which is on that Crisis CD.
Yep.
By then we were middle-aged. When we left Australia, we were just hokey, white, middle-class boys playing black people's music. I thought I was Henry Allen at that stage, and that'd do me. I would like to have been Louis Armstrong, and I was on some things, but my mindset was about that music.
Yep.
And I was so consumed by it, I wouldn't have known, I didn't even know much about the Beatles in those days. I came to the Beatles long after they were the Beatles. My musical interest was fixed on the thing I wanted to do.
Yep.
And I think we did it fairly well. But when you heard Roland Kirk particularly, Roland Kirk is an animal. He's a musical machine. He was. And he was one of the most beautiful and amazing men I've ever heard in my life. The sound he made on the tenor saxophone was like the sound I heard when I went to hear Louis Armstrong and my father at Old Worth Circus building where the art centre is there. I never forgot that sound. I've always had that sound in my ear, and I still do.
Yep.
When I want to play the saxophone, any sound that Roland Kirk got of his saxophone, I would love that sound. It just was alive. And he was a natural muso. He knew about, he loved Sidney Bechet, he knew about Lester, and so all of a sudden you listen to this guy playing three saxophones at once, which is amazing, and you think, party trick, what's the point? But then you listen to it and say, oh, that's seriously good. You know, that all works. And then you hear him drop straight onto tenor and play a blues that's just amazing. That does create a shock.
Yeah.
The other guy was Charles Lloyd. Charles Lloyd's still alive. I'm still in connection with Charles Lloyd on Facebook. And he's a beautiful man. I love what he did. And he had a big hit going on called Forest Flower in those days. Mate, I didn't understand Forest Flower, right? I didn't understand how that all worked. I had never listened to any of that.
Yeah.
So that did have a big effect.
Yeah.
Now, I look at that as like hearing Louis. Those guys opened my ears to things that I would never have heard. And it was the same for Al. And I remember that interview, and I don't think he really covered the effect, because he was still in the moment of saying, well, we weren't really to be compared with those people because we were just doing this hokey stuff.
Yeah.
No, we were to be compared to them, because when Roland Kirk heard us, he realised that we weren't bullshit artists wearing, you know,
funny hats
and bloody white shoes. We were trying to dignify the music.
Yes.
So that's what you're doing.
Yes.
Whatever you want to do in music, if you're not dignifying it and it's not about the music, well, it's bullshit.
Yes. Yes.
And it's always been like that for me.
That was really the moment then when, say, people like Alan Brown and Richard realised that there was another whole progression of things to do.
I take some issue with it. It is simply that it's all one thing.
Yeah.
It's all one thing. Look, when you listen to John Coltrane playing the ballads with Johnny Hartman,
yes,
if that doesn't move your heart, in the same way as Billy playing with Lester and Teddy, then you're not awake.
Yes, that's right.
You're not awake. And so I can't even these days, I can't listen to all of Miles Davis, but there are some things I listen to Miles Davis and I'm in tears over.
Yes, yes.
Work that out.
Yeah, it's great. So tell us about, I think you mentioned that you travelled around Poland for a little bit as well, didn't you?
They put us on a bus and drove us around, and we would play these concerts, and we'd open them, and then Roland Kirk or Georgie Fame would come on, and then, or one or other of those, then finish it, and then we were in the bus. Now, Georgie Fame did it all by air. We were in the bus with Roland Kirk, but we were also in the bus with Charles Lloyd.
Yes.
And he didn't stay on the whole thing. Well, the drummer, I don't know whether you know these people, the drummer that Charles Lloyd was using, a guy called Jack DeJohnette, and the piano player was a guy called Keith Jarrett.
Oh, yeah.
Keith Jarrett's the same age as me. I was playing cards with Keith Jarrett while we were in the bus. Okay? So...
What a story.
And I actually didn't get that music until a lot later, because there wasn't a gap in my brain to really try and put in the effort and listen to the Cologne concert or listen to... And now one of my favourite records is a record that Keith Jarrett made when he had that terrible disease that debilitates you, and he'd go down at night and play the piano, and it's called the Piano and the Night and the Music and You or something, and they're just ballads. He just plays ballads on the piano, and they're so beautiful. Yeah, well, I don't think it is that it was different. What I think it is that it was hard for white middle-class people from Australia that were so intent on trying to do what they were trying to do, to have the mind space to then say, oh, well, we should keep listening. Yeah. It took me a long time to get to fall in love with Charlie Parker, and I think 3 or 4 people who sent me a record of Charlie Parker playing just with a guitarist, and he played Body and Soul, I Found a New Baby, a lovely ballad, the name of which escapes me, and one other song, just 4 songs. Yeah. And there was the bridge between swing and what was in my heart, and bebop. Yeah. And all of a sudden bebop entered my heart. And I loved it. Well,
that was really great. So how long did you stay? I know you came home about 1970, didn't you?
No, that's close. We came back. We were contracted to Sitmo to come back. I think after about, don't hold me to it, but it was either about 18 months. Prue knows, because I met her there.
We're now into the phase of back in Australia after that there, so I know that you did a lot of work in that time there. You started off with people with Alan Leake.
When I got back, I was pretty shell-shocked because my girlfriend departed me at the airport on the way home. My father had died that morning, and I left my brothers in London, who I'd been with, don't go on. And I got back and I was moping around the house, and Smacker Fitzgibbon, Smacker sang with the Onions at the 100 Club one night, and he said it was the happiest thing he'd ever done in London, and he was never going to forget it, and he never did. I got him onto the stand and he sang it and won the heart. And his sister came up and it was a wonderful night. But Smacker rang me and he said, mate, you can't mope around, you've got to come and start playing again. And then Aid also made sure I played, so I did some gigs with Aid, so I started back playing again. And before I knew it, I was playing quite a lot with Smacker. I was playing a hell of a lot with him. And Aid had a few gigs and he'd always use me, well, not most of the time he'd use me. So by the time the band got back, I was playing again. But by that time, the band had been together a bit long, and they wanted to explore other things. And that's the effect of A, being together too long, and B, taking it to a stage where there wasn't much more we could do in that area, or so we thought. Then I started to look outside the Onions. There were still Onions gigs, but they were fading. So I initially started to play mainly with Smacker and those guys. Then I'd play with the Leake Band. When Dick Tatum retired, hurt, I got in there for a couple of years. And he always seemed to get a fair bit of work. And there was always stuff going on. And then by 1975, we'd moved our manufacturing company to Billingen, and that meant I would go to Billingen.
Yep.
And at that stage, my life changed pretty dramatically. And at that stage, it felt like the Onions was going to stop completely. It didn't. And so there's two parts to that story. One is the Billingen story meant that I started to build up contacts in Queensland and in Sydney, so that I'd get work at a decent level in those places. And the rule was that I would work as a senior, executive in the company, but that if a gig came up, I would always take it, always.
Yes.
And I did the whole time.
Oh, that was very lucky. So I noticed there, just doing some research, that you were involved with a bebop group that with Alan Brown and Bob Settergreen. That was in Swanson Street, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I'd call it a bebop group, but probably it was close. It was the beginnings of an RJ for Alan and Richard, and they were getting that going, and they took that off to Montreal and all that. And that had a whole life of its own. Yeah. And Bob Settergreen and Alan and I all went to Haileybury. Bob was a bit older than us, and so it was a beautiful arrangement that we were all as schoolboys back together again. And I think we were playing a couple of nights a week there for a while. And that was over the road from RMIT in a restaurant. Yep. And that was the last sort of serious continuing gig I ever had in Melbourne. Right. And it was Andy Brown on bass. No, not Andy Brown, who was it? It'll come to me. But it was just a piano, bass and drums with Richard and I. Yep. And it was lovely. Yeah. It lasted about 18 months, I think.
Yeah. Well, that was really good. So when you got to Bellingen, that was a bit of a musical desert at that time, wasn't it?
No.
No, wasn't it?
Yes and no. Graham Bennett, the ex-drummer from the Melbourne New Orleans Jazz Band, rang me and said, I'd spoken to him about it, and he wanted to get out of Melbourne, and he had experience working for Arnos and other manufacturing companies, so we employed him as a production manager for a while, for a long time, and he was good at it. So I had a drummer, and then after a while, a guy rolled into town called Arthur Golding, who was a fine guitarist. He'd been the musical director for Peter. I can't remember their names. Anyhow, he'd been a musical director all over the world with a big act. And then, lo and behold, Dick Barnes rolled in. So we had the Promised Land band.
That was the Promised Land.
Promised Land, Graham Bennett, Dick Barnes, Arthur Golding and me. And it was a good band. So we started to do gigs around the area, and there was plenty, and then the Jazz Festival started. I started to run that. That got bigger than Ben-Hur. So there was always gigs going on.
Yeah.
And then I was getting work in Sydney and I was getting work in Brisbane.
Yeah. So we should just pause a little bit tell us about the Bellingen Jazz Festival and the club, because you finished up, you were awarded an OAM, Order of Australia Medal for your contribution to that, which is rather terrific.
Well, I'm not sure I deserved it, but anyway, it's what it is. I like it. I'll have another one if you like, but the company sponsored quite a lot of jazz artists into Bellingen. So we had Ralph Sutton, we had Scott Hamilton, Cal Collins. We had about 10 or 15 people. So we'd bring them into town, bring a rhythm section, usually from Sydney if we needed them, and then use local players as well, and fill various places around Bellingen with an international act.
Yeah.
So that was outside the jazz club. That was just something that our company did to try and make me happy, I guess. And then I got involved as the director of the thing, and I knew, because I had the connections of people that would come and play and make an interesting festival. And that was good. It ran really for 25 years, and by then the demographic in Bellingen, which had been people of all ages who were a bit interested, had changed. And what happens to towns like Bellingen is that they're artistic communities because they're cheap for people to come and live in. When Nimbin happened and all that stuff, people went to Bellingen because it was cheaper.
Yeah.
And they were mostly artistic, musical or creative in some way.
Yeah.
That builds the town into something interesting. There's a bit of a war with the locals as it happens. And then other people come in and say, oh, shit, this is a lovely place, we'd like to live here. And they've usually got money. And then something happens, all the property values go up and none of the artistic people live there anymore. I was lucky, I had a job and a company and 50 employees and all that stuff, so I wasn't a bit of a situation. But in the end, all those sorts of crazy people that were open to all sorts of music, and we didn't just play traditional jazz in that festival, we played the whole gamut, Sandy Evans, the whole, fantastic, 10-part invention, and it was a lovely time for Bellingen. It was a big event, it was a great event, and maybe I did deserve an OAM, I don't know, but all I know is that by the time it ran its course, I had to put it to death like a dog that had reached the end of its life, because to go on would have been to wreck the 25 lovely years, and it was going to go into real financial mischief.
Terminal decline.
It was in terminal decline. And so I moved on.
Yeah.
And so did the town. And there's nothing ever been like it there since.
Yep.
And there isn't an audience for it now.
Yeah, that's right.
Tragically.
The things have moved on. So some of the other people that you did work with in that time after there, I just noted down, with Tom Baker. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved with that at Unity Hall. Yeah,
when that gig started, which now would have been over 60 years ago, whenever they couldn't find someone or they wanted an idiot to come and play the trumpet, they'd ring me because I was close to Gary and I was close to Roger.
Yes.
Roger Janes stayed with us in London. He came over with Graham Bell, and I loved him. He was a brother. He was a really unique product of Melbourne, as was Don Heap.
Yes.
They were just old Melbourne mates that were in this mighty gig, so I'd go and play there whenever I could. And sometimes I'd just go and sit in, other times the gig would be there and away we'd go. So that was lovely. But Tom was always around. He was playing there, and I'd drop on a saxophone or whatever, or he'd do Vicky verse, and we'd have lovely nights there. And then Tom got a couple of gigs that I'd go and do regularly. So if I had the Unity, I'd have a couple of gigs with Tom, and then be something else and something else. All good.
Yeah.
Tom and Lynn Wallace and sometimes others would come up to Bellingen. Often they'd come to the festival. Often Jeff Bull's band had come to the festival. Often bands from Brisbane come down to the festival. So they were in the house and around a lot. So if I couldn't go to them, they'd come to me. And Tom, for many years, would come up and have a holiday and go trout fishing with Lynn Wallace up in the Armidale National Park. So they'd come and spend a few days at home, and Tom would cook marvellous curries, and we'd have terrific nights of mucking around and talking, and then off he'd go.
Yeah.
When he died, like a lot of them, he broke my heart.
Yeah, he did. That was
Still
taken much too short, wasn't he?
Oh,
so what about your time, people like, I know that you did some jobs with Carol Ralph and Colin Nolan.
Oh, Carol, I'd always loved Carol because I'd heard her with lots of bands, and she wanted to get her own thing going, and she invited me to play. So it was Carol, Cole, Ed Gaston, and the drummer. Now I won't forgive myself for forgetting his name because I love him. It'll come to me. Anyhow, that band did about 50 or 60 gigs, I reckon. Festivals and God knows what, all over the place.
Yeah.
And Carol was wonderful. And the last one we did of that was at the Noosa Festival, which by then had really got going. I got involved with that before it started. That's now in its 30th year.
Yes. Yeah.
And so Carol did that a lot with that band. And so that was a fairly unique experience because Cole was such a great player. But he had a lot of, he was a special. And playing with Ed Gaston, mate, for 3 or 4 years as we did, it was good. It was just, she'd ring up and there'd be a few gigs and I'd go and do them, that's it. We did Manly a few times, we did Wangaratta a couple of times. It was a good band.
Yeah.
Lovely band.
So
But I was one out, just being I called myself the comic relief. There's a lovely anecdote I'll tell you about that band. You asked for anecdotes and I'll give you one. Quite early on, Carol, I got all her chord books and put them together with her help at home. She came up and we put them together as best we could. And a lot of the songs she sang were in the key of A flat because she'd sung with Jeff Bull's band a lot, which the Spirituals and a lot of the New Orleans stuff's in A flat. On the second or so gig with Cole, he's dead now, so I can mention this. He got Ed and I, and he said, "I don't do A flat." I said, "Okay, mate." He said, "It'll be G." Righto, so it's only a semitone, won't matter, she won't notice. Righto, mate. So every song that was written out to be played in A flat, we played it in G. And I never told Carol, she didn't notice. Ed died, Cole died, and one night I saw Carol at a picture theatre in Sydney. We were going to see the same film. I said, "Carol," I was sitting next to her and she'd stopped singing and she wasn't all that well. I said, "Carol, I know this won't cheer you up, but I have it on my conscience to tell you." Da-da-da, Cole didn't do A flat, it was always G. And she said, "You bastards, you bastards." And then I said, "Look, don't take this the wrong way, Carol, but did you ever notice?" She said, "No." I said, "Well, there you go. Sounded great.
Yeah.
We fooled them. Who gives a bugger?"
Yeah. Did Cole ever give you a reason why he didn't do A flat?
Didn't do it. That's a lot of guys, just they're rooted in. I'm a bit the same. I play in a covers band at the Bellingen pub once a month, and I'm having to play in D and E and A.
Yeah.
That's country I never really visited much, other than the odd weird bridge.
Yeah.
Well, I'm visiting it. I'm enjoying it. So
well,
what?
That's great. And
but
it's
Cole just didn't feel that he was as... He obviously had his patterns worked out in the more usual keys, and there's plenty of them. And oddly enough, he was pretty good in D flat. Work that out. It's only the next step round the clock. So I don't know.
Yeah. Oh.
He just said, "I don't do A flat."
Yeah.
We took him at his word.
Yep. So tell us about how you got involved with Noosa.
Jono rang me and said, "Oh, we want to start this thing." And Richard and Patsy were involved with Jono in the first fundraisers to get it going. So I went up to Taunton and played in a pub there, which was the first sort of fundraiser to get the... There was a jazz club going there, but it was pretty spasmodic at that stage. It was really about getting a festival going.
Yep.
And that was 30 years ago.
Yep.
So I haven't missed one, and I'm now the patron.
Yes.
So God help them. I don't know what that means, but anyhow, but it's had its ups and downs. And I mean, when Jono died, he got killed on the road during the festival, crossing the bloody road in Hastings Street. And it was Jono's concept, and I love Richard, and I admire, and I really miss Patsy, and I admire the fact that they kept the original concept of the thing going, and that is that no organised bands are supposed to go, and it's all put together like a jazz party.
Yes.
And that's the concept.
Yes.
I think it's good.
Yes, it gives you lots of variety and things. Yeah. I can certainly attest to the joy of going there. It's a fantastic gig, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. So the other thing too that you were involved with were with John Buchanan.
John was very, very good to us, mainly because of I've got to remember the clarinet player's name, and he won't forgive me for this. Anyhow, David Ridyard.
Yep.
I'm getting old. Dave Ridyard rang me and said, "Do you want to do some Clarence Williams stuff for John Buchanan?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Who else in the band?" And we started, I think the first one we did might have been actually at Newcastle Festival, but not a Buchanan. And then John got us some he had something in North Sydney, RSL or something there, and then he had, I reckon he had about 7 or 8 festivals running at that stage.
Yeah, we had some in the old Parliament House, didn't he?
Yeah, I did a few of those.
And then down at Barrel.
Yeah. Did those. And I did one here in Victoria at some town I can't remember. Anyhow, it got good. And then Len joined us, so mostly it was Len Bernard, John Scurry when he was available, Tapparelli, Chris Tapparell, me and Ridyard.
Yeah.
The band from heaven.
And Donny Hoop?
Don, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, well that's a wonderful...
It was a band from heaven. And so that was really, in many ways, the last band that Len played with. Pretty much when Len died and Tappers died, obviously it had finished just a bit before that band stopped.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was lovely, and it did a lot of gigs, and I was so grateful to John Buchanan. He was...
Yeah. And then you had some involvement with Dr. Jazz.
Milam came... I met Milam at the Royal Terminus Hotel in Brighton when we were both about 18. And the year after that, I caught up with him again at the Glenelg convention, and he and Lockie were as thick. Lockie Thompson, who were as thick as thieves, a clarinet player, Australia's military attaché to Thailand, and Colonel Thompson and Milam were thick as thieves, and I was on the edge of that. I was very close to both of them. I was very fond of both of them, and I did a lot of playing with them. And Milam was a goer. He always had bands going and restaurants and God knows what. And he was bringing out all these American artists. So I got involved with all that. And I played a lot with him and with Lockie and all that. Yeah, it was good.
That was in Brisbane?
Mostly.
Yeah.
But a lot, Alan Leake moved up, to Queensland, and he'd ring me and say, "Oh, do you want to do a Louis Armstrong tour?" And I'd say, "Oh, yeah, I'll do that." And so we'd go around and do Mount Isa and Whoop Whoop and Bum Flap and whatever else. And then there was Milam always doing stuff, and so there was a lot of work. I had to turn a bit of it down. There was so much, you know.
Yeah.
So, and you've got to understand that, I'm sure you do, that I was then one of a diminishing number of trumpet players that knew a lot of different books. I could play all the mainstream stuff. I could play some of the bebop stuff. I could play all the, all the usual traditional war horses, and many others. And so I'd get a lot of dipping.
Yeah.
And I could play the trumpet and the saxophone, which was a bit silly, but that helped a bit.
Yeah.
So I've had a charmed life.
You have?
Still have.
You still have got a charmed life in there, that's for sure. Well, now, I noticed somewhere the Up the River band, was that that particular one? Or was that another one?
That was it. That was Mike Hawthorne, Joe Bloomfield, and the bass player was from here, and I'll try and remember his name. He died during the thing going, and then Dave McCallum, another Melbourne guy, was on drums.
Yep.
Out of the John Hawes band. So that was at the Story Bridge Hotel.
Yep.
Well, that ran for quite a long time.
Yeah. So that's through there, and then you got involved. You were, Noosa was going at that stage, and then there was the Cheap Suits band.
That was one I put together for the Bellinger Jazz Festival.
So what was the composition of that?
Dave Ridyard was playing baritone. Who was playing clarinet? God, anyone. Lots of people were in it. It was like a moving feast. It was about an 8-piece band that I'd just sort of push into shape on the day.
Right. So what sort of repertoire were you playing?
Whatever we could manage. And it was good.
Yeah.
Bob sat in with it a couple of times, and we had a few of the contemporary musicians sitting in with it now and again, and it was good. It was okay,
Yeah.
And Washo had come along, and Ian Date had come along, and us, and it was beautiful.
Yeah.
But it was like get to the gig and think of a few songs and see how we can make them interesting. That was all it was.
Yeah.
And I liked the idea. But it was really designed to give a bit of different colour to what was going on in the more organised band section of the Bellinger Jazz Festival, which was always organised band.
Yeah, I'm there with it. So just casting back over the people that you played with and over the years, who have been the people that have been your mentors and the people that you admire most?
Aid in particular. I had a falling out, not with Aid, but with Aid's missus, and I won't go into any details on it, but I had been close to Aid, and when Bill Howard died, we did the last gig with the Onions at that point in '96 with Aid. And earlier I'd said that the Red Onions pretty much finished when I went to Bellingen, and that was true, but when Bill Howard got burnt out by the fires, Ash Wednesday and all that stuff, they rang and said, "Do you want to do some benefit concerts for Bill?" And I said, "Of course I do." And we found that we were all back together and we loved it. And so that band had a second life, and Milam was then running a few festivals, and the Onions started to get a whole lot of work again, and made another trip to Europe, and then made 2 records. One was Crisis, and the other one was the Bill Howard Memorial album, both of which are very fine pieces of work.
So when you went back to Europe, that was, what, about 92, wasn't it?
92, exactly. Yeah. The year we made Crisis.
Yeah. And what sort of reception did you get in Europe then?
Okay, but things had changed. There was less venues, and it was organised pretty badly. So, but it was okay. We played one club at a joint called Eckenförde, which is up the top of Germany on the way to Denmark, which we'd played at many times before in the earlier tour, and it was still going 20 years later.
So that gets us up to about 2000. So just tell us what you've been doing for the last 20 odd years.
Pretty much the same as I've been doing for the previous 20 years. If gigs come, I play. I do a lot of driving. I do, at one stage I had an aeroplane and I used to fly from gig to gig, and yeah, it was all right. But I've been lucky, as I said. I get asked to dep. Jeff Bull had to have a back operation, so I did a little tour with his band and stuff like that. And I get gigs at Noosa. I still get the odd gig in Melbourne. I do a lot of practice. I think about it more than I used to. But yeah, it just goes on.
Goes on. And
there is less because there is less, and
Yes,
it's
that's
not
right.
it's not simply because of COVID. It's a lot of things.
Yes. As you said, I think before, that it's the demographics have changed. It's not the popular music of the youth, is it? And that's the...
Yeah, and it may never be, but how you can't tell.
Yeah.
Who could have ever forecast that? For example, if you look at the music scene in America, when the Beatles came on, you would have to say to yourself, why would the Beatles be a big seller in America? They're selling coal to the Eskimos.
Yeah.
And then you look at America and you see the arrant, hopeless, bloody racism that exists there, which meant that all of those players that influenced the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, not that I know much about them, but certainly people like Eric Clapton too, all of those great black people were able to go to England and Europe and play
Yes.
in clubs and be treated like proper human beings,
Yeah.
and not, that's your hotel, that's your hotel, that's your
Yes.
restaurant, that's your restaurant.
Yeah.
In their own hometowns and in their own, so
Yeah.
and the result is that the English musicians had exposure to the real McCoy of blues music
Yes.
and jazz.
Yes. Yeah.
When we were in England, the Manchester Sport Guild was bringing out great American players to play with the Alex Welsh Band. And they were people like Wild Bill Davidson, Ruby Braff, I could go on. And then there was Ronnie Scott's.
Yes.
And then there was the ballrooms. There was what were they called? There was a ballroom in nearly every suburb of London and lots of towns.
The Hammersmith Palais was...
That's it.
Yep.
And they were run. The bands like Joe Loss Band. He had lots of them.
Yeah.
Like Farrington was the guy who was trying to be full. And so when you meet a guy like Danny Moss, the saxophone player who came to Perth and used to play at the Bernard Jazz parties that I went and played at a few times, Danny Moss started out playing in those gigs 7 nights a week.
Yeah.
Now that music is about, getting good musos is about opportunities to play.
Yes.
So English rock and roll musicians and English jazz musicians could hear the real McCoy and get plenty of work.
Yeah.
Now in Australia, it's always been a scuffle.
Yeah.
More and it's never going to change, and it's probably getting worse.
Yeah. Do you think that that jazz? What do you think is going to be the future of jazz in Australia? Or maybe the word these days is not necessarily jazz; it's improvised music. Not sure whether.
Look, there are two things that I think are remarkable in this day and age. I don't look at the negative side of it. I try and look for the pretty notes, as Charlie Parker said. And the one pretty note is a guy in Barcelona who runs the St Andre Jazz Band or whatever. I don't know whether you've ever seen that. That's on YouTube. Everything they do is on YouTube. They're young people that are beautifully schooled. They're playing good instruments. I don't know how it's funded. Joan Chamorro is the guy who runs it. And they are now producing kids that are playing, there's a trombone player in Singapore called Rita Payes, who is so original, so beautiful, and she combines a lot of jazz stuff with a lot of
improvised
Spanish tinge stuff.
Yeah.
And they are punching out people. So John Eric Kelso goes and plays with them. Scott Hamilton goes and plays with them. So they're getting exposed to great musicians without any limit to where it takes them and
Yes.
what the material is.
Yes.
I see that as a great thing, and I see that as a template that if you want young people to play, get off their bloody electronic devices, get them into a music program that asks them to be the best and says, if you really get into this, it may not be your career, but there's something that'll do great good to your head. And you look at the 50 or 100 young people that I've observed going in that program, doing all that. Now there's another guy called Emmett Cohen, who's a wonderful piano player, and during COVID used to have a thing called, I think it was at Emmett's Place. And he would simply bring them into his flat. He had a grand piano and he would film it all on YouTube. And this is getting to a bit of a bigger point. YouTube is the great ruiner and fixer of all sorts of problems. For me, YouTube means if I dial up the words body and soul, I will get 500 versions of body and soul.
Yep.
So I can pick out which ones I've never heard before and learn something from that.
Yep.
So YouTube as a teaching tool and a learning tool for me is fantastic. Wasn't available when Ade was handing us chord books
Yep.
and telling us how to play. Ain't going to give nobody any jelly roll, and what the clarinet should do and what the trombone was going to do. But my point about this guy Cohen is that those programs were watched worldwide, and that they had all sorts of young players and old players and players from around New York, and it wasn't all good. But it showed that there is still a richness in
Yes.
it, and it was done at a high level.
Yeah.
And when you look at the number of views he's getting, he now tours the world based on the fact that, and he was downbeat piano player of the year last year.
Yeah.
Now, to me, what happens in the world is technology to some extent will, in its own way, will either inhibit growth or will fertilise it.
Yes.
In my optimistic, my mother used to have a saying, travel optimistically. I travel optimistically. In my optimistic view of the world, YouTube is a vehicle for great good if you want to explore it.
Yes.
Because I can listen to a guy who's playing today in New York and struggling or got it, and I can say, yeah, that seems to me to be on the right track. Oh, no, that guy's got the disease.
Yes,
and what's the disease for me? The disease for me is that technique is important, but technique is not going to make someone fall in love with a ballad or to be taken on a voyage emotionally.
Yep.
What's going to take them on a voyage emotionally is getting far enough into the music that all of a sudden you realise that something inside you is being communicated to other people.
Yep.
Now, I don't look at it in those terms when I'm trying to get some notes out of the trumpet, but I know, in fact, that's what's happening.
Yep.
Without trying to make it sound
Yep.
too grand.
Yep. Yep.
My pathetic efforts are whatever they are.
Yep.
But I look at other people and I say, well, mate, and it comes back to listening to people talking about great films and great acting, and to listening to Count Basie.
Yeah.
It's about the gaps, mate.
Yes.
Don't fill them all.
Yeah, that's right.
Leave space.
Well, I
Play
remember.
something. So listen to Lester Young, and listen to Count Basie. Play something, and let people hear what's going on, and then put in some more, and listen to Billy, her timing, and Louis, and listen to those people. The timing of what they're saying
Yes.
has got time to go in.
Yes.
If you're playing so many music that you're like Donald Trump, flooding the zone with bullshit,
Yep.
it doesn't make up for emotion. That's
Yeah.
just still bullshit. You're
Yeah.
just flooding the zone.
Yep. Yep.
Stop flooding the zone, figure out which the pretty notes are,
Yeah.
and try and make that the task, not calisthenics for trumpet players playing higher, louder and longer, not I can play so fast on the bloody saxophone, dogs can't hear it.
Yep.
You know? Get it back to, and let's finish on this, when you go back to Ade Monsborough, who was my main mentor,
Yes.
listen to what he plays.
Yeah.
They're beautiful things he's playing. They're quite simple ideas,
Yeah.
but they transmit all sorts of information
Yes.
that you've got time to listen to.
Yeah.
Because he's not,
Yeah.
you know,
He's not all over the,
not all
over the
over
place.
here end of the sermon.
Well, have we covered, do you think, most of what we wanted to achieve here, Brett?
Has jazz got a future? I wouldn't know, but I see signs that it will change and never die, and that'd be the bit that I'd close on. And I don't think if it dies, it dies. What can you do?
Yeah.
But I think there are all sorts of opportunities nowadays where people won't necessarily go and listen to what we listened to last night at the Emerald Hotel, but they will listen to the music because it's available.
Yes. Yep. Well, I think that's really good. Well, on that note then, Brett, thanks very much for making the trip down from New South Wales, and for those there with it will know that this is the precursor to going to the 77th or 78th
God knows.
Jazz Convention at Mildura this year, and another beautiful way for the music to keep going. So thanks a million for everything, Brett.
Thanks very much, Mel. Appreciate it.
The very end